Section 12 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles. The Tortoise-Shell Cat, from Grimm. Once upon a time, there was a miller who lived all alone at his mill, except for 3 apprentices. He had neither wife nor child, and he was growing old. "I shall not be long for this world," he said to himself, "and I must leave my mill to one of my apprentices, but which one shall it be?" Then the old miller fell a-thinking. He was very fond of horses, at least he was sure he would be fond of them, for he admired them very much, though he had never owned one. At last he cried, "I know what I will do. I want a fine horse, the most of anything I can think of. I will send out my 3 apprentices, and the one who brings me back the finest horse shall have my mill and all else that I leave in the world." So he called the 3 apprentices to him and told them all that was in his mind. "Now go," he cried, "and see who shall bring me the finest horse." So early next morning, the 3 apprentices started out. Now one of them, named Hans, was smaller and younger than the others, and the 2 older ones said, "What can he do? One of us will be sure to win." When night came on, they were weary with traveling, and they lay down to sleep in a wood. Early in the morning, the 2 older apprentices wakened. "Let us steal away and leave Hans," said one of them. "He will only hinder us in our search." And as the other agreed, they stole quietly away, leaving Hans fast asleep in the woods. The sun was shining when Hans wakened. He rubbed his eyes and looked about. Then he shouted, but no trace could he find of the 2 who had gone. "Alas, what shall I do?" cried Hans. "I do not know the way of the woods." "Are you in trouble?" asked a voice close beside him. Hans started in surprise, for the speaker was none other than a beautiful tortoise-shell cat. "Yes," replied Hans, as soon as he could speak for amazement. "I have been left here alone in the woods, and I do not know my way." "Ah, I see," said the cat pleasantly. "But do not be alarmed. You set out in search of a horse, and you shall find one if you do as I bid you." Hans was more than ever amazed at this speech, but he knew at once that this must be an enchanted cat. "I shall be glad to do as you bid me," he said. "Very well," answered the cat. "You are to serve me well and faithfully as I require, and in the end I will give you a handsomer horse than any you have ever seen." So Hans went gladly with the cat, and soon they came to a great castle. "This is where I dwell," said the cat simply. 2 servants in livery came out to meet them, and they too were cats, as were all the attendants and inhabitants of the castle. After Hans entered the palace, he was waited upon by cats, his meals were served by cats, his room was cared for by cats, but never before had Hans lived upon such fine fare, amidst such beautiful surroundings. Upon the first day of his stay at the castle, the tortoise-shell cat presented him with a silver hatchet. "This is for chopping wood," she said. "You are to go into the forest each day and chop enough wood to keep the castle warm." What a task, thought Hans, but he said nothing, and when he reached the forest, he began to swing his silver hatchet. What was his surprise to find that a tree fell with every blow, for it was an enchanted hatchet, and in a short time he had wood enough to fill all the fireplaces in the castle and some to spare. Soon after this he was given another task. He was to cut the grass in the meadows adjoining the castle, so that the horses in the stables might have hay. For this task he was given a scythe of silver and a whetstone of gold. The scythe, like the hatchet, was enchanted, and Hans' task was completed before he would have believed it possible. Hans' evenings were spent in visiting with the tortoise-shell cat, and they became very good friends, indeed, for she was kind and intelligent and accomplished. The other cats furnished entertainment, and the days went by quickly. One morning the tortoise-shell cat said to Hans, "I want a new castle. It will be a small castle, but it is to be made of silver and gold, and you must build it for me." "I?" cried Hans, thinking that now an impossible task had been set before him. But the tortoise-shell cat showed him all the material for the castle, such as beams and joists and frames, and they were all of silver and gold. And when Hans began building, he found that all the parts fitted perfectly, and the golden spikes were driven in with one blow of his hammer. When the castle was completed, Hans addressed the tortoise-shell cat and said, "I have finished the 3 tasks you set me. Now I would like to receive the horse I have earned, that I may take him to my master." So the tortoise-shell cat led the way to her stables, and there were 12 horses, each one handsomer than any that Hans had ever seen. Hans was almost overcome between joy and fear. Could it be possible that one of these horses was to be the reward for his labor? Then the tortoise-shell cat spoke. "Go back to your master," she said. "I will have 2 of my servants show you the way. See what the other 2 apprentices have brought, but do not be discouraged. In 3 days I will send your horse to you. Do not fear." So Hans left the castle and made his way back on foot to the mill, the 2 cats in livery showing him the way, though he was dressed in the old clothes he had worn when he reached the castle. In the meantime, the 2 older apprentices had returned. "See, master," the first one said, "I have brought you a horse as you wished. It was the very best I could find. I hope it will please you." Then the miller looked at the horse and he said, "How is this? The horse is blind. Did you think to cheat me?" Just then the second apprentice appeared, leading a horse, and he too said, "See, master, I have brought you a horse, as you wished. It was the very best that I could find. I hope it will please you." Then the miller looked at the horse and he said, "How is this? The horse is lame. Did you think to cheat me?" But he had hardly finished speaking when Hans came walking down the road with no horse at all. Then they all cried, "How is this, Hans? Where is your horse?" "My horse will follow me in 3 days," said Hans, for he was sure he could trust the tortoise-shell cat. But the other apprentices laughed, and the miller sent him to the goose house to sleep. The apprentices returned to their work, and the miller was puzzling his brains to know who should have the mill, when they all heard music, and looking out they saw a royal procession coming from the direction of the forest. First of all came a man in rich livery, leading a beautiful black horse that stepped daintily and held his head high. After that came a golden carriage, drawn by 8 other fine horses, and in the carriage sat a princess of wonderful beauty. And the princess was no other than the tortoise-shell cat, who had been changed back to her own form after Hans had performed the tasks she had given him to do. After the carriage of the princess came a long retinue of servants. The procession stopped, and the princess spoke to the miller. "Here," she said, "is the horse which Hans earned by his faithful work. Is it as fine as those which your other apprentices brought?" At that, the 2 older apprentices hung their heads in shame. "The horse is yours," she continued, "but as for Hans, I want him to spend the rest of his days at my castle, where he proved his kindness and worth." Then the princess had Hans clothed in beautiful garments, such as a prince might wear, and she took him up in the carriage beside her and drove away, and Hans lived happily in the castle with the princess ever after. End of Section 12. Section 13 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Healing Water, from Grimm. There once was a king who was very ill, and nothing whatever could be found to cure him. Now the king had 3 sons who looked so much alike that people who had seen them but a few times could not tell one from the others. One evening, as the 3 sons walked sorrowfully in the palace gardens, they met a little man who said to them, "You grieve because your father, the king, is ill. I know what will cure him. If one of you will go to the enchanted castle in faraway land and dip from its fountain a chalice of its healing water, your father shall drink it and live. But," continued the little man, "I cannot tell you the way to the castle. That is for you to find out. But I warn you, 'tis a dangerous journey." With that the little man bowed and vanished. "I will go," said the eldest son. "It is my right." So he ordered the finest horse in all his father's stables and set out to find the enchanted castle and the fountain of healing water. He had gone but a short distance when he met a dwarf in the road. "What is your errand?" asked the dwarf, doffing his cap politely. "'Tis my own affair," replied the eldest son haughtily as he rode by. "Aha," said the dwarf when he had passed. "Haughty people ask no help, and they receive none." The eldest son rode on, and the path he took led him between two mountains, and presently he found himself wedged in between walls of rock. He could go neither forward nor backward, nor could he turn around, and there he stuck, for the dwarf whom he had needlessly slighted had willed it so. A long time passed, and when the eldest son did not return, the second son said, "I fear some evil has befallen our eldest brother, but our father the king must have the healing water. I will set out to seek it." So he chose the best horse in all his father's stables, and set forth to find the enchanted castle and the fountain of healing water in faraway land. But it happened to him as it had to the eldest brother, for he too met the dwarf, who asked him, "What is your errand?" And he answered quite as haughtily as his brother had done, "'Tis my own affair." Then he rode on into the mountains and became wedged between two walls of rock, so that he could not go forward nor backward, nor could he turn around. And there he stuck, for the dwarf had willed it so. After a time, when the second son did not return, the youngest son said, "Surely some evil has befallen my brother, but my father must have the healing water." So he too set out to seek it. When he had gone a little way, he met the dwarf, who asked him, "What is your errand?" The youngest son, whose name was Otto, stopped and answered respectfully, "My father, the king, is ill. I seek the enchanted castle in faraway land, wherein is the fountain of healing water." Then the dwarf said, "Since you have answered me respectfully, I will help you." So he told Prince Otto how to find the way to the castle, and he gave him a rod and 2 wheaten loaves. "The gates of the castle are of heavy iron," he said, "and guarded by 2 fierce lions. But if you knock upon the gates with this rod, they will open, and if you throw a wheaten loaf to each lion, they will not attack you. You will find the fountain in the court of the castle. Dip from it a chalice of water and hasten away. When the clock strikes 12, the iron gates will close again." Then Prince Otto thanked the dwarf for his help, took the rod and the bread, and rode away. And it turned out just as the dwarf had told him. He reached the castle gate safely and struck them with his rod. They opened, and the 2 lions ceased roaring and ate the bread that he threw to them. Then he made his way into the broad and beautiful court. There he saw a wonderful fountain of silver, and the water fell from it in a silver spray. Beside the fountain stood a lovely princess, who smiled upon the prince and told him he was welcome to fill his chalice at the fountain. So he filled it gladly, but instead of hastening away, as the dwarf had warned him, he lingered to speak to the lovely princess. And as he talked with her, he forgot the lions and the iron gates, till suddenly he heard a distant clock striking the 12:15. Then he hastened away, but not until the princess had given him a kiss and promised to marry him at the end of a year. As Prince Otto ran toward the heavy gates, they began to move, and as they closed, they clipped off a bit of the prince's heel. But he held close the chalice of healing water, and he had the princess's promise to marry him, so the hurt of his heel mattered little. Then Prince Otto rode away, but he had not gone far when he met the dwarf. "How did you fare?" asked the little man. "I have filled the chalice," said the prince, "and I thank you for your aid. But tell me," he added, "where may I find my brothers? My father will grieve if they do not return." "They are haughty men," said the dwarf, "and they will be jealous of you for finding the healing water. You will fare better without them. But my father the king will grieve sorely if they do not return, and I wish to find them." So the dwarf directed Prince Otto to the mountains, where his 2 elder brothers were held fast, and he rode rapidly and released them, and they went back with him to their father's palace. On the way, Prince Otto told them all about his adventures, and showed them the chalice of healing water. He also told them of the lovely princess, and of a promise to marry him at the end of the year. But the 2 elder brothers were jealous, as the dwarfs had said they would be, and though they pretended to feel glad, they really were filled with envy and with angry thoughts. After a long journey, they reached their father's palace. Then there was great rejoicing, for the king drank of the healing water, and became well and strong once more, and all the people were glad and praised Prince Otto. This caused the elder brothers to become more jealous than ever, and though they said nothing to each other about it, they both resolved to win the princess away from their younger brother. Now, as the end of the year drew near, the princess ordered that the approach to her castle be paved with pure gold, and this was done, and the year was up on the day after the pavement was finished. Then the princess said to her servants, "Whoever rides straight up the golden pavement and asks for me, admit, but none other." Not long after, a horseman came riding swiftly. He looked like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water. It was the eldest brother of Prince Otto. When he saw the golden pavement, he checked his horse. "That is only for the feet of the princess," he said, and riding to the left, he approached the castle and asked for the maiden. But the servants sent him away, as the princess had commanded. A little later, another horseman came riding swiftly. He also looked like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water. When he saw the golden pavement, he turned to the right, saying, "I will not tread the princess's gold underfoot. I would put it to better use." This was the next older brother of Prince Otto, and he reached the palace and asked for the princess. But the servants sent him away, as the princess had commanded. Soon after, a third horseman, who looked exactly like the prince who had filled his chalice at the fountain of healing water, came riding swiftly, and this was Prince Otto himself, and he was so eager to see once more the beautiful princess who had won his love that his eyes looked straight ahead, and he did not even notice the pavement of gold. And he rode straight up the golden pavement and asked for the princess, and the servants threw wide the doors, and the princess came forth to greet him. So they were married as the princess had promised, and they lived in great contentment ever after. End of section 13. Section 14 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles. The Lad Who Wondered, from Descent. Once, many years ago, a man who was very poor had 3 sons, whose names were Peter, Paul, and John, and he sent them out into the world to seek their fortune. Peter and Paul, the 2 older sons, took matters very much as they came, and spent but little thought upon them. But John, the youngest son, who was called Jack, was always wondering about this, and investigating that, and trying to find out the reason for things. The older brothers made fun of this habit of his, but this did not trouble Jack at all. "What good does it do you to run after this and that?" they asked him. "Oh, I have the fun of finding out about things," answered the youngest brother, with a laugh. They had not gone far on their travels when they met a servant of the king's household, who stopped to exchange a bit of gossip. "What is the news of the day?" asked the brothers. "The king is greatly troubled," replied the servant. "He wants the great oak that grows by the palace cut down, but no one can be found who can hew it. As fast as a chip is hewed out, 2 grow in its place, so instead of getting rid of the tree, he finds it growing larger and larger." "Is that all the king's trouble?" asked Jack, thinking that even a king might find matters worse than this to trouble him. "No, that is not all," said the servant. "The palace is built upon high ground, and there is no well of water near. The king wants a well dug near the castle, and no one can be found to dig it, for all strike solid rock as soon as they begin." "And what will the king give to one who hews the tree and digs the well?" questioned Jack again. "He will give him the princess for his wife and as much gold as he needs," replied the servant. "And do you think you can dig the well and fell the tree?" asked the older brother scornfully. "It is worth trying for," said Jack. At this the older brothers burst into loud laughter, and the servant said, "But whoever tries and fails is banished to a lonely island. The king has grown ill-tempered from having his oak made larger and his ground dug into for naught." With these words the servant went on his way, and the 3 brothers resumed their journey. As they traveled along, a sound of hewing and chopping fell on their ears. It seemed to come from the midst of a forest, high up on a hillside. "I wonder what that means," said Jack. "What does it matter to you?" asked the others. But Jack sprang up the hillside while Peter and Paul lay down, grumbling at having to wait for him, yet really glad of an excuse to sleep by the roadside. Presently Jack came upon a strange sight. It was that of an axe hewing of its own accord at a great tree, and at the third blow the tree fell. Then Jack addressed the axe and said, "So you can hew all alone?" "I can," said the axe, "and you had better take me along with you." So Jack took the axe and put it into his leather pouch. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. After a time they came to a great heap of rock, and on the other side there was a sound of digging and shoveling. "I wonder what that is," exclaimed Jack. "What does it matter to you?" grumbled the brothers. But Jack was already climbing over the rocks, so the brothers again lay down to sleep. When Jack reached the farther side of the great boulder, he saw another strange sight. A spade was digging and shoveling right through the rock, and all of its own accord. Then Jack addressed the spade and said, "So you can dig all alone?" "I can," said the spade, "and you had better take me along with you." So Jack took the spade and put it in his leather pouch. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. They had not gone far when they came to a stream of water. "I wonder where this stream comes from," cried Jack. "What does it matter to you?" growled his brothers. But Jack was already running along the bank of the stream, and as it was cool and shady there, the brothers once more lay down to sleep. Jack went on, and the stream grew smaller and smaller, till at last he came to a little cave, and in the cave lay a little acorn, out of which the stream was flowing. Then Jack addressed the acorn and said, "So you alone furnish water for this beautiful stream?" "I do," said the acorn, "and you had better take me along with you." So Jack stopped the hole in the acorn with moss and put it in his pocket. Then he joined his brothers, and they went on together. Presently they came in sight of the king's palace. "I am going to try for the king's reward," said Jack boldly. "Ho, ho, ha, ha," laughed the brothers. "You will end your days on the lonely island, but good luck to you. We can travel the faster alone." Then Jack went boldly to the king and told him he was ready to try his hand at hewing the oak and digging the well. "You know the penalty if you fail," growled the king. "Yes, your majesty," said Jack. "Then try," said the king, and Jack drew out his axe and said to it, "Hew away now." At the third blow the great oak fell. Now the princess was looking from one of the windows of the castle, and when she saw Jack, she said to herself, "I hope he will succeed." For though Jack's clothing was mean, he had the manner and bearing of a true man. As soon as the tree had fallen, Jack drew out his spade, and he said to it, "Dig away now." And the spade began to dig right through the rock, and in a very short time it had a great well made. Then Jack let himself into the well, and taking the acorn from his pocket, he laid it in a corner of the rock and pulled out the bit of moss. "Flow away now," he cried as he clambered out, and in a few moments the well was full of water, and a little stream went tumbling over the cliff in a beautiful cascade. The king was delighted, and all his followers shouted. Then the king said, "You have done your work well, and the prize is yours." Then he clothed Jack in splendid apparel and led him to the princess, who was all blushes, and as soon as the wedding feast was made ready, they were married and lived happily ever after. End of section 14. Section 15 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Lad Who Visited North Wind, from Descent. Once upon a time there lived a lad in the North Country whose mother was very poor. She was a widow, and they two were all alone, and the only food they had was a little grain. One morning his mother said to him, "Lad, go to the wee bit of a barn and bring me some grain. I must grind it and bake us some cakes. There is nothing left in the house to eat." So the lad went to the wee bit of a barn and got some grain and came out again. But just as he stepped from the door, swish, came north wind and blew away every kernel. Then the lad went back into the wee bit of a barn and got a second bowl of grain. And as he stepped out the door, swish, came north wind again and blew all the grain from the bowl a second time. Well, at that the lad went back and got a third bowl of grain, and that was all the grain there was left in the barn. and when he went out the door, swish, came North Wind a third time and blew away every kernel. "Now we have nothing left to eat," cried the lad. "I am going to North Wind and ask him to give me back our grain." So off he started, and he traveled a long, long way, but at last he came to North Wind's house, and he went up and knocked boldly on the door. Then North Wind opened the door with a bang. "Good day," said the lad. "Good day," roared North Wind. "I came to return your visit," said the lad. "My visit?" roared North Wind. "Yes," said the lad, as fearless as could be. "You came to our house and snatched away all the grain from my bowl, and now my mother and I have nothing left to eat. I came to ask you to give it back." "Wee wee," said North Wind with a shrill whistle. "As bad as that? Why, I didn't know it was all the grain you had. I can't give it back, because you see no two grains are in the same place. But I'll do the best I can. Here's a tablecloth you may take home with you. Whenever you are hungry, say, 'Cloth, spread the board, and give me somewhat to eat,' and you will have a better feast than ever your grain would make." So the lad thanked North Wind, tucked the tablecloth under his arm, and went away. But he had come far, and it grew dark before he reached home, so he turned into the door of an inn for a night's lodging. As he was hungry, he sat down beside a table and laid his cloth upon it and said, "Cloth, spread the board, and give me somewhat to eat." Immediately the cloth was covered with dishes of substantial food, besides dainties the like of which the lad never had seen before. He ate heartily, while the landlord and his guests stood by in amazement. But while the lad slept that night, the crafty landlord stole away the magic cloth and put another, which looked the same, in its place. In the morning the lad tucked the cloth under his arm and hastened home, that he might share his breakfast with his mother. But when he laid the cloth on the table at home and spoke the magic words, not even a crust of bread appeared. "Well," cried the lad, for he was a sturdy lad, "I will go to North Wind again." So off he trudged as before, and knocked boldly at the door of North Wind's house. Bang, the door opened, and "Good day," said the lad. "Good day," said North Wind. "That tablecloth that you gave me is not any good," said the lad. "It served me one good meal, but no more. I want the grain that you snatched from my bowl." "I cannot give you the grain," said North Wind, "but I will do the best I can. Here is a hen. Take it with you, and when you have need, say, 'Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat,' and every time the hen will lay a golden ducat for you." "Fine," said the lad. Then he thanked North Wind, and tucking the hen under his arm, he started off. When he reached the inn, it was again dark, so he turned in for the night. But as he had no money to pay for his supper, he said to the hen, "Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat." And the hen laid a golden ducat, and the landlord and his guests all stood about and wondered. But while the lad slept, the landlord took away the hen which the North Wind had given, and in its place put one of his own hens of the same color. When the lad wakened, he hastened away home to show his mother the wonderful hen. But when he said, "Hen, hen, give me a golden ducat," the hen laid nothing at all. "Well," cried the lad, for he was a plucky lad, "there is nothing for it but I must visit North Wind again." So off he started, and reaching North Wind's house, he knocked boldly on the door. "Good day," said he as the door banged open. "Good day," said North Wind. "I have come for the grain that you snatched from my bowl," said the lad. "The hen that you gave me laid a single ducat, and now it lays no more." "Well, well," said North Wind, "we must see about this. I cannot give you back your grain, for no two kernels are in the same place. But here is a good stout rope. It can tie up a thief in a twinkling, and no man can untie it. You have only to say, 'Tie, rope, tie,' and the thief is caught. If you want to let him go, say, 'Loosen, rope, loosen,' and the knot will untie." Then North Wind laughed, and the lad laughed, for they both had their suspicions, and the lad thanked North Wind, and tucking the rope under his arm, he started off. As it grew dark, he reached the inn and turned in for the night. He placed the rope beside his bed and pretended to sleep. Presently the landlord came into his room and looked about. He carried in his hand a rope, which looked just like the one by the lad's bedside. "I wonder what marvelous thing the rope can do," he said to himself, putting out his hand to take it, when the lad cried, "Tie, rope, tie!" and in a twinkling the landlord was bound hand and foot. "Now," said the lad, "do you give me back my magic cloth and my hen that lays gold ducats?" And when the landlord found that no one could untie the rope and loose him, he ordered the magic cloth and the hen to be brought and given to the lad. And when the lad had them safe under his arm, he cried, "Loosen, rope, loosen!" And immediately the rope fell off, and the lad gathered it up and went on his way. He went straight home to his mother and said, "Mother, you shall go hungry no more. I have my magic cloth which spreads a feast, my good little hen which lays gold ducats, and a rope to tie the thief who tries to steal them from me. And we will blame North Wind no more for snatching away our grain, for he is a right good fellow after all." End of section 15.
Section 16 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Once upon a time there was a princess who had been promised in marriage to the prince of a faraway country. As the time for the wedding drew near, the queen prepared beautiful dresses and rich embroideries and costly ornaments of gold and silver and all the finery that a young girl loves to wear. "I want the prince to be proud of his bride," said the queen, as she tried the dresses and ornaments upon the princess. And the princess smiled happily as she thought of the wedding. Now the wedding was not to take place at the castle of her father, but at the home of the prince in the faraway country. It was a long journey, but the king chose his most trusty horse, Falada, to carry the princess to her new home. And the queen chose the most beautiful maid in all the king's household to accompany the princess. And the maid too was given a fine horse from the king's stables to ride. Now Falada, the horse which was to carry the princess, could talk, but only the king knew this. Just before they started, the queen handed a small packet to the princess, saying, "Keep this with you. It contains a lock of my hair, and it will act as a charm. When you are in trouble, it will help you." So the princess thanked her mother with tears in her eyes, and she said, "Farewell," to the king and all the household, and set off upon her journey. But the maid whom the queen had chosen was envious of the princess, and as they rode on she kept thinking, "Why should the princess have the best of everything? The queen chose me because of my beauty. Perhaps I can find a way to win the prince for myself." Presently they came to a stream of clear water, and the princess said to the maid, "Bring me a cup of water to drink. I am thirsty from the dust of the way." She drew from her bodice a golden cup which the queen had given her, but the maid replied insolently, "If you wish a drink, get it for yourself. Why should I wait upon you?" Now the princess was very young, and she knew not what to do, but her thirst was so great that she slipped from off her horse and knelt beside the stream to drink. And as she stooped, the packet which the queen had given her slipped from her bodice into the stream. The princess's eyes were so blinded with tears that she did not see it, but her maid saw it and was glad. "Now she is no longer protected by her charm. I can do what I will," she said to herself. As the princess rose to remount Falada, she was astonished to see her maid upon Falada's back. "Give me your veil and your embroidered gown," said the maid, "and put on my coarse dress in their place. I shall present myself as the bride, and if you dare to contradict me, I shall have you thrown into a dungeon." The poor princess could do nothing but weep, and she mounted the horse which had been given her maid and followed sorrowfully on till they came to the castle. There the maid presented herself as the true princess and asked that some work be given the young maid she had brought with her as a companion. So the true princess was sent into the field to help the goose boy tend the geese, while the maid was led into the castle where there was great rejoicing and feasting. For several days the feasting continued, and each day the true princess went into the fields with Curdken, the goose boy, to tend the geese. On the way to the fields they had to pass the stables where the king's horses were kept, and each time they passed the princess cried out, "Oh, Falada, Falada, What would my mother say?" And a voice from the stables answered, "O princess, princess, with the geese you shall not stay." Then the princess would go on somewhat comforted, while Curdken wondered but said nothing at all. Out in the fields the princess let down her beautiful hair, which was all of pure gold, that she might dress it. When Curdken saw this, he said, "Oh, let me cut off a lock, it is all of shining gold." And he stretched out his hand to grasp it. But the princess called out, "Breeze, blow Curdken's hat away." And hardly had she spoken when Curdken's hat was lifted from his head and carried quite outside the field. When he had caught his hat and come back, the princess's hair was all dressed and coiled softly about her head, where it shone like a golden crown. Every day the princess called to Falada, "Oh, Falada, Falada, what would my mother say?" And the voice from the stables answered, "O princess, princess, with the geese you shall not stay." And every day the princess let down her shining golden hair, and when Curdken would snatch a bit of its gold, she cried, "Breeze, blow Curdken's hat away." And immediately Curdken's hat would fly quite out of the field. And every day the feasting and rejoicing continued in the castle. Now the king of the faraway country was very fond of horses, and one morning as he went through his stables he stopped before Falada's stall and exclaimed, "What a magnificent horse! It is the one which the princess rode." No sooner had he said this than Falada answered him, "The princess true is with the geese. The princess false is at the feast." The king stood still in astonishment. "What is this I hear?" he cried. "The princess true is with the geese. The princess false is at the feast," repeated Falada. As the king hurried from the stables, he almost tripped over Curdken. "Your Majesty," said Curdken, "I cannot have the strange maid with me longer," and he was all a-tremble with fright. Then he told the king how the goose girl spoke as she passed the stable, and of the voice that answered, and he told the king of the goose girl's golden hair and of how the breeze obeyed her. When he had finished, the king himself was all a-tremble with amazement, and he went straight to the field where the princess was tending the geese. At first she was afraid to tell him her story, because her maid had said she should be thrown into a dungeon. But the king told her not to fear. "Only tell me the truth," he said, "and I will protect you. I am the king." Then she told him all, and it was just as Falada had spoken. So the king took her by the hand and hurried to the castle. And he had her dressed in beautiful garments and led her to the prince. The bishop was about to marry the prince to the false princess, but when she saw the king leading the true princess into the room, dressed all in beautiful garments, she fled from the castle, and no one ever saw her again. So the prince was married to the true princess, and they lived happily ever after. End of section 16. Section 17 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. The Spring in the Valley, an Irish folk tale. On a large island in the midst of a great sea, there is a beautiful lake whose waters shine clear as crystal. On a quiet night, if your eyes are bright enough, you may look down through the water to its deepest depth, and there behold a wonderful sight. You will see a great stone palace with turrets and arches and gardens with flowers and shrubs and trees. You will see a high round wall with an opening like a door, and a solitary man with a crown upon his head, who seems always to be searching. Now you should notice this wall and its opening most particularly, for without it there would be no story for me to tell. Once, long years ago, where the lake now lies, there was just a quiet green valley, and bubbling up from the midst of the valley there was a spring of cool, crystal clear water. All the people of the valley used the water. They used it to make broth for the babies and porridge for the old men and women. They used it to cool the fevered brows and parched lips of those who were sick. Travelers drank of it and blessed heaven for water. Now there was a king living in the valley, and the spring was close beside his palace gates. And as the king saw the great numbers of people going day after day to the spring for water, he said to himself, "This will never do. There is no such water as this in all the world, yet every peasant drinks of it as freely as the king. Surely this should not be." So he determined to build a high wall about the spring and to make a door in the wall. And when it was finished, he locked the door with a golden key. "Now," said he, "I, the king, have control of the waters, and this is as it should be. No one can draw unless they use my golden key." Now the king had one daughter, and he declared, "Only my daughter shall be allowed to bring water from the spring and to use the golden key." The people began to cry and to beg for water, but the king shut himself away and would not hear them. Then he thought within himself, "I will give a great banquet. Everyone in the valley shall be made welcome, rich and poor alike. And at the banquet I will give them as much of the spring water as they wish to drink. Then they will be grateful." So the banquet was announced, and the king's couriers rode forth and bade all the people come. When the time arrived, the king's banqueting halls were thronged. All the people of the valley were there. And besides, there came from a neighboring country a young nobleman of such grace and manly bearing that the king made him most welcome. And the young nobleman danced long with the king's daughter and sat beside her at the banquet. There was one other stranger at the feast, an old woman whom no one knew. But as all who presented themselves were made welcome, no one asked whence she came. Now as they all feasted, the young nobleman said to the king, "I have heard much of the water of your spring. I should like to taste it." This was just what the king had waited for, and now he ordered his daughter to bring water in plenty for all the people to drink. But his daughter did not like to carry the water, for she thought it a task which the servants should perform. Then the young nobleman at her side said, "I will gladly go and help you." As they passed out the door of the banqueting hall, the old woman, whom no one knew, accosted the king's daughter. She held forth a metal vessel, beautifully wrought, and set with great glittering jewels. And as she did so, she said, "I have brought this as a gift to you. It is a magic vessel for carrying water. When it is full, the water will continue to flow from it, so that you need fill it but once, and all the people will be supplied." "Oh, thank you," cried the king's daughter, taking the beautiful vessel in her hands and hastening to the spring. She turned the golden key, and the young nobleman pushed open the door. Then she knelt to fill the vessel, but as she did so, it slipped from her hands and fell into the spring. Immediately the water gushed forth in a mighty stream. It filled the wall, it rushed through the door, and poured itself forth into the valley. The young nobleman grasped the hand of the king's daughter, and together they ran to the palace. But the water reached there as soon as they. "Run! Run for your lives!" they cried. "The water is filling the valley!" Then all the people sprang to their feet. But above the confusion and noise, the voice of the strange woman was heard as she cried, "Now shall the people have water in abundance, and it shall not cease to flow till the magic vessel which I gave to the king's daughter is found and removed from the spring." Then all the people ran and reached places of safety, all but the king, who stayed behind to search for the magic vessel. The water continued to flow till it filled all the valley and became a great lake as it is to this day. And the people built their homes about the lake, where they had water in abundance, and thanked heaven for it. The young nobleman married the king's daughter and took her away to his own country. The king, who stayed behind, was overtaken, but he was not drowned. Instead, he was condemned to live beneath the water, which he had wanted only for himself. And there he continues to search for the magic vessel, but he never has found it to this day. End of section 17.
Section 18 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold, The Magic Snuff Box, a folk tale. Once upon a time, there was a poor young man who started out to seek his fortune. He traveled many, many miles, and nothing would ever happen. "There is no luck in this," he said to himself. "I hope my fortunes will soon mend." Even as he spoke, his foot struck something hard in the path. It sounded like metal. He brushed aside the forest leaves and brought to view something white and shining. Picking up the object, he examined it, and to his surprise, found it to be a silver snuff box. Some fine gentleman must have dropped it, he thought, for the box was set with brilliant jewels. He opened it, and as he did so, the box said, "Ask me, and I will help you." The young man was so astonished that he almost dropped the box, and quite too frightened to do anything but snap the lid quickly shut. But he put the box safely away in his pocket and traveled on. Toward night he came in sight of a great stone castle, such as he had never seen before. He walked all around it, wondering at its size and its magnificence. As he reached the front gates, there came out a man wearing beautiful garments and with a crown upon his head. So the young man knew that he was a king, and that this must be a king's castle. The young man lay down that night in the woods opposite the castle to sleep, and while he slept, he dreamed. He dreamed that he was the owner of a castle even grander than that of the king. And his castle stood so close to the castle of the king that the king was envious of him. He wakened from his dream. It was still dark. He turned over, and as he did, so he felt the silver snuff box in his pocket. Then he remembered that the snuff box had said, "Ask me, and I will help you," and he thought, why not try it? So he took the snuff box from his pocket and opened it. "Ask me, and I will help you," it said as before. "Well then," said the youth, "I ask for a castle finer and larger than that of the king. I want it to sparkle with gold and jewels. Can you help me to that?" He had scarcely finished speaking when a most magnificent building rose as if by magic from the ground. And in the morning, when the king saw it, he was too greatly astonished for words, for his own castle looked quite mean beside it. He hastened to the golden castle, and when he saw its owner, he said, "Young man, I will give you my daughter in marriage if we may all come to your castle to live." And so the young man said, "Let me see your daughter first." So the king returned and brought his daughter, the princess, and she was so modest and so beautiful that the young man fell in love with her at once, and he was glad to do as the king wished. So the young man and the princess were married, and they had everything they could desire, and the king and queen came to live with them in the golden castle. But the queen was jealous and envious, and when she learned about the magic snuff box, she could not rest day or night for thinking how she could get possession of it. At last she bribed one of the servants to find out where the young man, who was now a prince, kept the box at night. Then she bribed another servant to get the box and bring it to her. As soon as she had the box in her hands, she opened it, and it said, "Ask me, and I will help you." Then the queen said, "I want this golden castle set down far across the sea, where the king and I may live in it and have it for our own." And almost as soon as she had spoken, it was done. But the prince and the princess with their children were left behind, and had only the stone castle to live in. And as the magic snuff box was gone, they became very poor, because the prince could no longer have things for the asking. Then one day the prince said to the princess his wife, "I will set forth and seek my golden castle and my magic snuff box of silver and jewels." So, bidding the princess and his children a sorrowful farewell, he journeyed forth. He traveled a long, long distance, and at last he came to the house of the moon. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O moon, in your travels over land and sea, have your rays shone upon my castle of gold with its jeweled casements?" And the moon replied, "No, my son, no such castle have I seen. But go to the sun. His rays shine farther and more brightly than mine. Perhaps he has seen it." So the prince journeyed on again for a long, long distance, till at last he came to the house of the sun. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O sun, in your travels over land and sea, have your rays shone upon my castle of gold with its jeweled casements?" And the sun replied, "No, my son, no such castle have I seen. But go to the wind. He penetrates where my rays cannot go. Perhaps he has seen it." So the prince journeyed on again. for a long, long distance, and at last he came to the house of the wind. He told his story, and when he had finished, he asked, "O wind, in your journeys over land and sea, have you searched out my castle of gold with its jeweled casements?" And the wind answered, "Yes, my son, such a castle have I found. It is far away over the water, but come with me, and you shall soon reach it." With that he picked up the young prince and carried him, more swiftly than thought, across the great sea, and set him down in a woods. And there, close at hand, he beheld his golden castle. That night he hid himself in the woods till all the castle lights were out, and then he let himself in with the golden key, which he had carried all these years since his castle was stolen away. And he crept up to the king's bedchamber and found the magic snuff box. He quickly opened the lid, and at once the box said, "Ask me, and I will help you." At that the king and queen wakened, and they called out, "Who is here? Help, help!" But the prince was too quick for them. Before the courtiers and the ladies in waiting and the soldiers could reach the chamber, he cried, "Take me with my golden castle back to my wife and children, but leave the king and queen here in this land beyond the sea." And it was done. The king and queen found themselves left without a roof over their heads, but the prince with his golden castle and his magic snuff box was back in his own land with his wife and children, and they were happy all the rest of their days. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Favourite Fairy Tales Retold. Old Mother Holle, from Grimm. Once, long ago, there were two sisters who lived together with their mother, who was a widow. Now, as sometimes happens, the two sisters were not a bit alike. One had bright hair and a fair skin, and she was as sweet and sunny in character as she was good to look upon. The other sister was dark and ill-favoured, while in character she was sullen and selfish. But strange as it may seem, the mother cared more for the dark sister, whose name was Ellen, than she did for Esther, the fair-haired daughter. She not only gave Ellen better food and better clothes, but Ellen's tasks were always light, while Esther worked hard from dawn till dark. When the other tasks were finished, Esther was set to spin, and as she loved the birds and the flowers and the grass, she took her spindle and sat down beside the well. She called to the birds, and they came and sang to her as she worked, and she tried to forget the harsh treatment and the unkind words of her mother and sister. But now and then her eyes would fill with tears, and so it happened one day that as she worked, she pricked her finger so badly that the blood came and stained her spindle. "What shall I do?" she cried in alarm. "If my mother sees my spindle so stained, I know not what she will do to me." So she leaned far over the edge of the well, hoping to reach the water and wash her spindle, but instead it slipped from her hand and dropped to the bottom of the well. With a cry, Esther leaned forward to catch it, but by this she lost her balance, and she too fell into the well. But then something very wonderful happened. Instead of finding herself in a wet, disagreeable place, she was in a green meadow where flowers were blooming, and the air was soft and sweet. She walked along a little path which lay before her, and presently she saw beside the path a great oven built of bricks, and inside the oven were many, many loaves of bread. "Take us out! Take us out!" the loaves called to Esther. "We are baked just enough. Oh, do take us out!" So Esther stopped and took all the loaves of bread from the oven, and then she went on down the winding path. After a while she came to an apple tree loaded down with ripe, rosy-cheeked apples. Shake me, cried the tree to Esther. "My apples are ripe, do shake them down." So Esther stopped and shook the tree till all the ripe apples lay on the ground, and then she went on down the winding path. In a little while she came to a cottage, and there sat an old lady in the doorway. "I have watched you as you came down the winding path," said the old lady, whose name was Mother Holle, "and I would like you for a maid. I know you are willing, and I am sure you are neat, and that is all I require." Esther saw that Mother Holle looked kind and pleasant, so she was very glad to stop a while. Every morning Esther shook old Mother Holle's feather bed, and then the people cried, "Oh, see, the snow is falling!" And Mother Holle gave Esther good food and the kindest treatment. But after a time Esther said, "Mother Holle, you have been good to me, and I have been happy here, but I must go home to my mother and sister." Then Mother Holle said, "It is right that you should go. Come, I will show you the way, for you have been a good girl." Then she led her out through a door, and as Esther passed through it, a whole shower of gold fell upon her, so that her apron and all her pockets were filled quite full. Then Mother Holle pointed the way, and Esther ran home to her mother and sister, and when she showed them all the gold that she had brought, they treated her quite kindly. The very next day Ellen said that she too was going to find Mother Holle, for she wanted an apron full of gold. So she dropped her spindle into the well, and then she jumped in after it. And it happened to her as it had to Esther, for she found herself in a beautiful green meadow, and before her was the winding path. She had not gone far when she came to the great oven built of bricks, and full of newly made bread. "Take us out, take us out," cried the loaves. "We are baked just right. Oh, do take us out." "Why should I?" answered Ellen. "I do not want to dirty my hands with your oven." And she ran on down the winding path. After a while she came to the apple tree, all loaded down with ripe rosy-cheeked apples. shake me," cried the tree to Ellen. "My apples are ripe, do shake them down." "Why should I?" answered Ellen. "Your bark is rough, it would hurt my hands." Then she ran on down the winding path. In a little while she came to the cottage, and Mother Holle was sitting in the doorway. "I have come to be your maid," Ellen said, without waiting for Mother Holle to ask her. "Very well," said Mother Holle, "but you must be willing and neat, and shake my feather bed every day." Ellen promised, and the first day she did it very well. She shook the feather bed, and the people cried, "Oh, see, the snow is falling." The second day she only turned the feather bed over, and the third day she did not think of it at all. "You are a lazy girl," said Mother Holle, "and I cannot keep you for my maid." Ellen was secretly glad, but she only said, "Then I must go home to my mother. Will you show me the way?" "Yes," answered Mother Holle, "I will show you the way." Now for the golden shower, thought Ellen, as Mother Holle led her to the door. But when she passed through, a pot of black dye tumbled down upon her. "That is all you have earned," said old Mother Holle as she turned back into the cottage. And when Ellen reached home, instead of an apron full of gold to show, she had only her dirty clothes. End of section 19.
Section 20 of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold. Erich No-Luck, a Russian folktale. Once upon a time, there was a hunter named Erich, who went day after day into the woods in search of game, but no game did he bag. And this happened so often that at last he came by his friends to be called Erich No-Luck. One day, when, as usual, he was roaming the woods, he sat down to rest at the mouth of a cave where the air was cool. And as he thus sat, thinking of his ill luck and his poverty, he heard a tiny voice, which seemed to come from far, far back in the cave. "Help me! Help me!" cried the voice, but it was such a tiny voice that it sounded like the chirp of a bird. Erich's curiosity was aroused, and as he was a bold man and fond of adventure, he entered the cave and looked about. It was dark in the cave. The air was heavy, and the bottom was covered with stones and slime. "Be careful!" cried the tiny voice again as Erich advanced. "Mind where you step, or you may go 1,000 feet down to the bottom of this cavern." "Who are you?" called Erich, "and where are you?" "I am here in this jar," called the tiny voice. "I was shut in the jar 70 years ago by a wicked magician, and no one has come to the cave since. Oh, do let me out! I will repay you well if you will." So Erich No-Luck picked his way carefully over the stones till he was far, far back in the cave. Then he saw a soft glow of light, and upon reaching it found that the glow came from a metal jar, and the cover of the jar was securely fastened by a heavy seal. Again the voice cried, "I am here, here in the jar. Just break the seal and out I come, then I will repay you." "But how am I to know that you will repay me?" asked Erich. Try me, said the tiny voice. "I believe I will," answered Erich, and with that he broke the seal, lifted the cover of the jar and looked in, but not a thing did he see. "Where are you?" cried Erich. "Are you fooling me?" "No," said the voice close beside Erich's ear. "I'm right here, but no man can see me,
for to mortals I am invisible. But for 3 days you may ask of me whatever you will, and you shall have your wish. When you need me, call Mirza, and say these words, 'Go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt.'" So Eric made his way out of the cave and once more took up the bow and arrows he had left at the entrance. "I wish I might find a deer in the forest," he said, and then he thought, "Why not try my little friend at the trick?" So he called, "Mirza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." Hardly had he finished when he heard a crackling of branches, and a fine young deer stood under the trees before him. Swiftly he sped an arrow, and the deer dropped. "Aha!" cried Eric No Luck. "Wait till I show this to my friends." He started to carry the deer home, but he had not gone far when he met a gypsy leading a fine horse, and the gypsy offered the horse for sale. "I wish I had the money to buy it," said Eric No Luck. "Then I could carry the deer home in fine style." Then again he thought of his invisible friend. "Mirza," he cried, "go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." In a moment he felt something hard in his pocket, and thrusting in his hand he drew out a fistful of gold pieces. With these he paid for the horse, and throwing the deer across its back, he mounted and rode toward home like a nobleman. But before he had cleared the wood, he heard horses behind him, and turning, he faced a whole band of robbers who had learned from the gypsy of the gold he was carrying. "Mirza," he quickly called, "go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." He had hardly finished speaking when there was a noise of galloping and shouting, as though a large party of mounted men were coming that way, and when they heard it, the robbers turned their horses and dashed off as fast as they could go. "Thanks, good Mirza," said Eric No Luck. "Thou art truly keeping thy promise." As Eric rode on, he was presently joined by a youth who rode as fine a horse as his own, and who was dressed like a knight. He had a mantle thrown over his shoulders, and a plume in his hat, and a sword hung by his side. "You have a fine horse," said the youth. "If 'twere not for your deer, I would think you were on your way to join the Tsar's regiment." "And what is the regiment to do?" asked Eric No Luck. "Have you not heard?" asked the youth. "A large band of robbers is in the woods, and they threaten to attack the palace itself. They are dangerous men, and well armed, and they must be driven from the country." "And does the Tsar need a regiment to disperse these robbers?" asked Eric No Luck, thinking of his own recent encounter. "Indeed, you would think so if you had heard of the deeds they have done," replied the youth, as he galloped away. Eric rode on home with his deer, and when he reached there, he cried, "Here, friends, share the deer amongst you. I am going in search of better game." "How is this, Eric No Luck?" asked the men, but Eric had galloped away while the men stood and gaped in astonishment. Now Eric had heard wonderful stories of the grace and beauty of the princess at the castle, the Tsar's daughter, and in his mind he had formed a plan which he counted upon Mirza to help him carry out. "I must be better dressed," he said to himself, "before I can present myself to the Tsar." So he called, "Mirza, go where thou wilt, and bring what you wilt." And in a twinkling he was clothed in gold-embroidered garments, with plumes in his hat and a jeweled sword by his side. Then he rode gaily on, and soon he came in sight of the Tsar's castle. There were horsemen about, who had come to join the Tsar's regiment, but none was dressed as magnificently as Eric No Luck. He made his way boldly to the castle and asked an audience with the Tsar, and when he was admitted he said, "O Tsar, I have come to rid you of the bold robbers who have threatened your castle. Send these men away, I have no need of them." The Tsar was astonished. "How can you do this?" he asked. "I have an invisible friend who will help me," answered Eric, "and if I succeed I want to marry your daughter." At this the princess began to shed tears, but Eric quickly said, "Mirza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." And after that the princess's teardrops turned to tiny golden rosebuds, to diamonds, and to opals as they fell. Then the princess stopped weeping for very wonder, and began to look favorably upon Eric No Luck. And the Tsar said, "Very well, try your luck with the robbers. If you succeed, you may marry my daughter, but if you fail, off goes your head." The Tsar frowned fearfully as he said this, and Eric trembled a little, for the odds were very great, but he said softly, "Mirza, go where thou wilt, and bring what thou wilt." Immediately, the castle was surrounded with the most brilliant troop of soldiers ever seen in the land, and at a signal from Eric they dashed away into the woods. and the robbers scattered before them like dust before the wind, and were seen no more in the land. There was a magnificent wedding at the palace when Eric was married to the princess, and all his friends cried, "He shall no longer be Eric No Luck, but Eric the Lucky shall be his name." End of section 20. End of Favorite Fairy Tales Retold by Julia Darrow Cowles.